As the cameras rolled, Monica Bradford smirked, calling JD Vance Trump's errand boy. But she never expected what came next. With sharp wit and unshakable confidence, Vance turned the tables, exposing her hypocrisy on live TV. The audience gasped, the host crumbled, and America watched a takedown like never before. "You won't believe how it ends." Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The lights in the studio were blinding, their intensity bouncing off the sleek modern set of The Nation Speaks, a primetime political talk show notorious for its aggressive debates. The air inside the studio was thick with anticipation, a silent energy crackling through the audience as they waited for what they assumed would be another predictable takedown of a conservative guest. At the center of the storm, Vice President JD Vance sat across from Monica Bradford, the show's fiery liberal host, whose career thrived on tearing apart conservative figures live on air. She had built her reputation on being unshakable, relentless, a woman who never lost control. But tonight, she had no idea what was about to hit her. Monica, dressed in her signature tailored blazer, exuded confidence as she leaned slightly forward in her chair, her manicured fingers tapping against the glass surface of her desk. Her smirk was one of practiced arrogance, a look she had perfected over years of on-air battles. She thrived on moments like these, when she could land a well-placed insult and watch her opponent squirm. Her producers had set the stage perfectly. The audience, hand-picked to lean in her favor, was primed to applaud at all the right moments. The questions were ready, the narrative was set, and in her mind, JD Vance was nothing more than another conservative stepping into her trap. The camera zoomed in, and the red live indicator flashed on the monitors. Monica wasted no time. She tilted her head, feigning curiosity, but her voice was dripping with condescension. "Mr. Vice President," she began, her tone slow and deliberate. "Let's be honest here. You're nothing more than Donald Trump's errand boy, aren't you?" The words cut through the studio like a knife, sharp and laced with the smugness of someone who expected no real resistance. The audience, already on her side, erupted in scattered laughter, a few even clapping, anticipating the verbal beatdown that was sure to follow. This was supposed to be the moment where JD Vance stumbled, where she would dominate the conversation and paint him as weak, as submissive, as nothing more than a puppet for the man sitting in the Oval Office. But something was wrong. JD Vance didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he chuckled, a deep, knowing laugh that didn't just dismiss her insult, but made it seem laughably weak. The laughter wasn't forced, wasn't defensive. It was the kind of laugh that came from a man who had been underestimated one too many times. The energy in the room shifted. Monica's smirk twitched ever so slightly. JD Vance leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk between them, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a cold chill down her spine. Then, with a smirk of his own, he delivered his first counterattack. "Monica," he said, shaking his head, his voice steady, unwavering, "if I'm Trump's errand boy, then what does that make you? An unpaid PR agent for leftist hypocrisy?" The audience gasped. Some laughed. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Monica had expected him to get defensive, maybe stumble over his words, or attempt to downplay the insult. Instead, he had flipped the narrative in a single sentence. Monica blinked, the smug confidence she had walked in with flickering for just a second. But she wasn't about to let him steal control of the conversation that easily. She leaned back in her chair, masking her momentary hesitation with a scoff. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes. "The whole country sees it. You follow Trump blindly. You defend him no matter what. Do you even think for yourself?" JD Vance didn't hesitate. He leaned back, his smirk widening, his demeanor still impossibly calm. "Monica," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, "do you think for yourself? Or do you just repeat the same tired talking points your producers feed you every morning?" A sharp intake of breath echoed from somewhere in the audience. Monica's lips parted slightly, as if preparing for a retort, but nothing came. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the fleeting look of surprise that crossed her face. The room, once buzzing with anticipation for another conservative to be humiliated on live television, was now holding its breath. JD Vance had just set the trap, and Monica Bradford had walked right into it. For a moment, Monica Bradford sat frozen. The flicker of surprise in her eyes was brief, but the cameras caught it, and the audience sensed the shift in momentum. This wasn't going according to plan. JD Vance wasn't playing defense. He was attacking with precision, exposing cracks in her well-rehearsed facade. But Monica wasn't ready to let go of her narrative just yet. She straightened in her chair, crossed her arms, and forced out a sharp laugh. "Oh, come on, Mr. Vance," she said, rolling her eyes in an exaggerated motion. "We all know how this works. You say whatever Trump says, you repeat his talking points like a good little soldier. So tell me, do you even have an original thought, or does everything have to be approved by Mar-a-Lago first?" The audience chuckled again, some regaining their confidence. Monica felt the tension ease slightly, believing she had found her footing again. But then she looked at JD, and her stomach dropped. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't defensive. He was amused. JD let out a small chuckle, shaking his head as if he had heard this all before. He leaned forward just slightly, closing the space between them, his piercing gaze never breaking from hers. "You know, Monica," he said, his voice even, almost too calm, "I appreciate the effort, really I do, but let's be honest. What you're doing right now isn't journalism. It's performance art." The audience let out a collective murmur. Monica felt her jaw tighten. "I mean," JD continued, motioning to the cameras, "look at this setup. The scripted outrage, the pre-selected crowd, the flashing sign in the back telling them when to clap. You came in here with one goal, to make me look weak. But here's the thing. Your entire strategy relies on one assumption." He paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing Monica to lean in just slightly, waiting for the next blow. "You assumed I'd be afraid of you." The crowd let out a soft oof. Even the studio crew, professionals trained to remain neutral, were visibly intrigued. Monica's fingers curled against the table. "Oh, please," she said, shaking her head. "You're deflecting, Mr. Vance. The question remains, are you anything more than Trump's errand boy?" JD smiled, his patience unshaken. "Monica, I have a question for you," he said, his voice smooth but sharp, like a blade sliding from its sheath. "You call me an errand boy because I stand by my president, because I support his policies, because I refuse to play the game of turning on my allies for media approval. But tell me this, who are you loyal to?" Monica's breath hitched. She opened her mouth, but JD kept going, his voice never rising, but hitting with the force of a hammer. "Who gives you your marching orders, Monica? Your producers? Your network executives? The politicians you secretly text for talking points before these interviews?" The audience shifted, some murmuring. Monica felt a tightness in her chest. JD tilted his head, watching her closely. "You sit here pretending to be an independent thinker, but let's be real. You wouldn't last a day in your industry if you questioned the wrong people, if you went against the narrative. You don't challenge power, Monica. You protect it." A sharp, stunned silence gripped the room. Monica's lips parted slightly. She began, but JD wasn't finished. "You want to talk about loyalty? Let's talk about your record." He leaned back, crossing his arms. 4 years ago, you sat on this very stage and told America Trump would never win again, that he was finished, that the MAGA movement was dead. And yet, here we are. He's in the White House and I'm sitting in the vice president's chair. You weren't just wrong, Monica. You were spectacularly wrong. The audience gasped. Monica's face flushed red. "And you know what?" JD continued, his voice lighter now, almost amused. "I'd have a little more respect for you if you just admitted it, if you said, 'Hey, I got it wrong. I underestimated the American people.' But instead, here you are, doubling down, pretending like your credibility wasn't shattered along with every failed prediction you made about this administration. Monica's hands gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white. JD smirked. So let's be real here. You don't have a problem with loyalty. You have a problem with who I'm loyal to. The audience erupted. Applause, shouts. Even those who had come in rooting for Monica sat wide-eyed, watching her unravel before their very eyes. Monica's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel it slipping. The control, the authority. She had to get it back. She swallowed hard, forcing her expression into something resembling composure. "Well, Mr. Vice President," she said, voice shaky but laced with forced confidence. "If you're not an errand boy, then what exactly are you? Trump's guardian angel?" JD chuckled, shaking his head. "No, Monica. I'm something you'll never understand." The room fell into silence, hanging on his next words. "I'm a man who stands by his principles." Monica's stomach dropped. The audience exploded again, and this time, Monica knew she was in trouble. The energy in the studio had shifted. Monica Bradford, who had spent her entire career crafting her image as the fierce, unshakable interrogator of conservative figures, suddenly found herself on the defensive. JD Vance had not only dismantled her attack, he had turned the tables, forcing her to justify her own loyalty, her own integrity, her own independence. And it was clear, in the way her shoulders stiffened, in the way her fingers curled against the desk, that she wasn't used to being the one under scrutiny. She tried to steady herself, inhaling deeply, pasting on that polished, performative smile she had mastered over the years. "Mr. Vice President," she began, her voice laced with a forced calm, "I think we both know that this isn't about me. This is about you and your willingness to follow Donald Trump wherever he goes, no matter how reckless, no matter how dangerous. You talk about principles, but let's be honest. You didn't support him at first, did you?" The crowd hushed, eyes darting between them. Monica leaned in, sensing an opening. "That's right," she continued, her smirk returning. "Back in 2016, you opposed Trump. You said he was unfit for office. You called him a cultural disaster, your words, not mine. But now look at you, Vice President, his most loyal defender. So tell me, Mr. Vance, did you really change your mind? Or did you just change your principles when you realized there was power in it for you?" She sat back, a smug smile creeping onto her face, waiting for the hit to land. It was a classic takedown strategy. Remind the audience of his past opposition, frame him as a hypocrite, cast doubt on his sincerity. It had worked on weaker men before. But JD Vance was not a weak man. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. Instead, he let the silence stretch just long enough for the tension to settle into the bones of every person in that room. Then, finally, he exhaled a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Monica," he said smoothly, "you almost had something there. You almost made a point, but, as usual, you stopped just short of the truth." Monica's smirk faltered. JD sat forward, elbows on the table, eyes locked onto hers. "You're absolutely right. I did have my doubts about Trump back in 2016. I was wrong about him. And do you know what the difference is between you and me, Monica?" She blinked. "What?" "I can admit when I was wrong." The audience gasped. Monica's lips pressed into a thin line. "I watched what happened," JD continued, voice gaining strength. "I watched as the media, people like you, sneered at the working class, mocked middle America, dismissed people's real struggles as nothing more than white resentment. I saw how Trump fought back, how he actually delivered on his promises, how he stood up to the same establishment that you spend every day protecting. And when I realized I was wrong, I didn't double down. I didn't pretend like my past statements didn't exist. I didn't lie. I did what real men do. I changed my mind, and I owned it." Monica tried to cut in, but JD held up a hand. "No, let me finish," he said, his voice steady, his control over the moment absolute. "You see, you think admitting you were wrong makes you weak. That's why you never do it. That's why you sat there 4 years ago telling the world that Trump would never win again, and now, instead of saying, "I misjudged the American people," you're desperately trying to rewrite history. Monica inhaled sharply, trying to maintain her composure, but JD wasn't done. He leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice, pulling the audience in closer. "You want to talk about loyalty, Monica? Let's talk about your loyalty. You sit there, night after night, reciting whatever script your producers put in front of you. You push whatever narrative they decide will get the most clicks, the most outrage, the most division. And the second you step out of line, they'll toss you aside like yesterday's news." She stiffened, but he wasn't finished. "Tell me, Monica," he said, tilting his head, "if your bosses told you tomorrow that the anti-Trump narrative wasn't selling anymore, that it was time to pivot, that you had to start praising him to keep your job, what would you do?" Silence. Monica's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. JD smirked. "That's what I thought." The audience erupted, applause, cheers. Monica could feel the energy of the room turning against her, slipping through her fingers like sand. Her carefully crafted image, her dominance over the conversation, was crumbling. She had to salvage this, had to. She straightened in her seat, forcing herself to regain control. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice measured, "this isn't about me. This is about the fact that you have hitched yourself to a man who has been impeached twice, who has been accused of—" JD laughed, a real, genuine laugh that sent a fresh wave of tension through the studio. "Ooh, Monica," he said, shaking his head. "You're really going there. The same tired, debunked talking points, the same manufactured scandals. That's all you've got?" Monica bristled. "These are facts, Mr. Vance." "No," JD countered, his voice firm. "These are distractions, because you still haven't answered my question. Who do you answer to?" Her throat went dry. "You want to paint me as some blind follower, but let's be real. You're the one who can't think for yourself. You don't get to have original thoughts. You don't get to admit when you're wrong, because the second you do, you're done, finished. Just another discarded pawn in the media's game." Monica's jaw tightened, but JD wasn't done. He leaned back, crossing his arms, watching as she fidgeted in her seat. "You asked me if I was Trump's errand boy," he said. "Let me ask you this. Who are you a puppet for?" Silence. Monica's face was pale. The audience sat in stunned anticipation. And for the first time in her career, Monica Bradford had no answer. Monica Bradford had never experienced a silence quite like this. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the weight of realization pressing down on her, suffocating, unrelenting. The cameras were still rolling, the studio lights still burned overhead, but the air in the room had thickened, charged with something electric, something dangerous. JD Vance sat across from her, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He wasn't rushing to fill the silence, wasn't giving her an easy out. He was letting her sit in it, letting the audience watch her unravel. For years, Monica had built her career on control. She controlled the questions, the narrative, the perception of power. But now, for the first time, she was on the receiving end of the interrogation, and she had nothing. No scripted comeback, no producer-fed talking point that could save her now. JD had cut through the performance, exposing something raw, something she wasn't prepared to confront, not in front of millions. Finally, she forced herself to speak, her voice barely steady. "I'm a journalist," she said, trying to regain her footing. "I ask the tough questions. I hold people accountable." JD raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Because so far, the only person being held accountable tonight is you." The audience reacted with another ripple of murmurs and knowing chuckles. Monica's cheeks burned, her professional armor cracking under the pressure. This was supposed to be her moment, her victory. Instead, she was trapped, scrambling for a foothold in a conversation she no longer controlled. She straightened her posture, forcing herself to regain the authority she was so accustomed to wielding. "Mr. Vance," she began again, her tone clipped. "This isn't about me. It's about you. It's about the fact that you have aligned yourself with a man who has been impeached twice, who—" JD exhaled sharply, a dry laugh escaping his lips. "Oh, Monica," he said, shaking his head. "You're really going there? The same tired, rehearsed talking points, the same media-manufactured scandals?" He leaned in, eyes narrowing. "That's all you've got?" Monica's lips pressed into a thin line. "These are facts," she countered, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "No," JD said firmly. "These are distractions." He gestured toward the audience, then to the cameras. "You still haven't answered my question. Who do you answer to?" She faltered. JD leaned back, letting his words settle. "You want to paint me as someone who just follows orders," he continued. "But let's be honest. You can't admit when you're wrong. You can't think for yourself, because the second you do, you're done, finished." He tapped a finger against the table. "Your bosses, your network, the elites who fund this little charade of journalism, they decide what you say, what you believe, and who you attack." Monica inhaled sharply, trying to contain the spiral she felt happening inside her. She could hear her producers in her earpiece, their voices frantic, but their instructions blurred together in a haze of panic. JD was exposing the very thing she had spent her career denying, that she wasn't the independent truth seeker she pretended to be. She was a performer in a political theater, and tonight the illusion was shattering. JD sighed, almost as if he pitied her. "You call me Trump's errand boy," he said, shaking his head. "But tell me something, Monica. Who were you working for?" The silence was deafening. For a split second, a flicker of something crossed Monica's face. Fear, doubt, maybe even realization. The audience saw it. The cameras caught it. And in that moment, Monica knew she had lost. She swallowed hard, grasping for a response, anything to claw back control. But the truth was, there was nothing left to say. JD Vance had won, and the entire world had just witnessed it. Monica Bradford sat frozen in her chair. The walls of her carefully constructed world were closing in, and she had no escape route. JD Vance was still seated across from her, unwavering, composed, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made it impossible for her to look away. The weight of the silence was unbearable, pressing against her chest, suffocating. The studio lights burned hotter now, or maybe it was just the panic setting in. Her usual smirk, the one she used as a shield, was gone. She could feel her hands trembling beneath the desk, out of sight from the cameras. But that didn't matter. The damage had already been done. The audience had seen it. Millions of viewers had watched her falter, stumble, and for the first time truly lose control. Monica cleared her throat, desperate to regain her footing. "Mr. Vance," she said, forcing a thin smile, "you've made it clear that you'll defend Trump at all costs. That's your choice. But let's not pretend that loyalty to him means loyalty to America." JD raised an eyebrow. "And you think you represent America?" A single, dismissive chuckle escaped his lips, and the audience reacted. It wasn't just amusement. It was realization, a shift in the energy of the room. People were starting to see her, not as the confident, all-knowing journalist she had built herself up to be, but as something else entirely. A pawn, a mouthpiece for an agenda she had spent years pretending didn't exist. JD leaned forward, elbows resting casually on the table. "Monica, you want to talk about loyalty? Let's talk about yours." Her breath caught in her throat. JD continued, his voice steady but razor-sharp. 4 years ago, you sat in this exact chair and told America that Trump's political career was over. That he was finished. That his influence was dead. He paused, letting the words sink in. Yet here we are. He's in the White House, again, and I'm sitting here as vice president. So tell me, Monica, how did that happen? The audience murmured. Monica clenched her fists beneath the desk. JD didn't let up. "I'll tell you how," he said, "because while you and the media elites were busy telling Americans what they should think, they were out there making up their own minds. You ridiculed them, mocked them, called them extremists for daring to disagree with you. He gestured to the cameras. And now, when the people have spoken loud and clear, when the very movement you tried to kill has come back stronger than ever, you're sitting here scrambling to make sense of it. Monica opened her mouth to interject, but JD cut her off. You call me Trump's errand boy, he said, his tone shifting, no longer just exposing her but challenging her. But the real question is, who do you work for? Who's been feeding you these narratives? Who's been telling you what to believe? Monica felt a cold sweat break out along her back. The pressure was unbearable now, the walls pressing in from every direction. You sit there, JD continued, pretending to be neutral, pretending to be some independent truth seeker. But you're not. You're just another voice in a long line of talking heads, repeating the same script that's been handed to you. Monica inhaled sharply. She could hear her producers barking in her earpiece now, shut it down, cut to commercial. But her hands were locked in place. Her throat was dry. JD tilted his head slightly, watching her struggle. You know what the difference between us is, Monica? He asked, his voice calm. I own what I stand for. You don't. The audience erupted in applause. Monica flinched. She felt the panic rise up her throat, the burning sensation of humiliation creeping in. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was Monica Bradford, the queen of liberal media, the woman who had made a career out of tearing conservatives apart. And yet, here she was, being exposed in real time, powerless to stop it. JD sat back, shaking his head. You want to paint me as some mindless follower, he said. But the truth is, Monica, you're the one following orders. You're the one who can't think for herself. And deep down, you know it. Monica's vision blurred, her hands gripped the desk. This couldn't be happening. But it was, and the entire world was watching. Monica Bradford's throat tightened, her pulse hammering in her ears. The studio lights, once a source of comfort, now felt like interrogation lamps exposing every crack in her carefully constructed image. Her smirk had vanished, her usual quick-witted deflections had failed her, and now she was sitting under the piercing gaze of JD Vance, a man she had dismissed as a mere puppet, but who was now holding up a mirror to her hypocrisy for the entire nation to see. She clenched her jaw, inhaling sharply through her nose. This couldn't be happening. This was her show, her domain. She was the one who set the rules, who controlled the narrative. And yet, as JD leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of quiet confidence, it was clear to everyone watching that control had slipped through her fingers like sand in a storm. Monica, JD finally spoke, his voice steady. Do you know what the difference is between us? He paused for just a second, letting the moment stretch. I know who I am. Monica's heart slammed against her ribcage. You, on the other hand, JD continued, have spent your entire career pretending to be objective, pretending to be fair, pretending to care about the truth when, in reality, you only care about power. The power to dictate what Americans should think, what they should believe, who they should support. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze burning into hers. And now, when that power is slipping from your grasp, you don't know what to do. A hushed murmur rippled through the audience. Even Monica's hand-picked crowd could sense it. The shift. The unraveling. She forced a dry swallow, feeling the oppressive weight of JD's words settle on her shoulders. This was bad. Worse than bad. Catastrophic. She could hear her producers screaming in her earpiece now. Cut to commercial, regain control, do something. But her body felt frozen, rooted in place by the sheer force of JD's presence. She forced a laugh, though it came out thin, brittle. So, let me get this straight, she said, trying to regain some semblance of authority. You're saying I am the one who lacks conviction? JD didn't hesitate. Absolutely. Monica scoffed, but it was weak. Let me ask you something, Monica, JD said, his voice softer now, almost curious. If your producers told you to change your stance tomorrow, would you do it? The question hit her like a freight train. JD leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. If the network executives who control your paycheck sat you down and said, "Monica, we need you to start supporting Trump," would you do it? Monica's lips parted, but no words came. "You see," JD continued, his tone never rising, never wavering, "you want to paint me as an errand boy, a puppet, a blind follower. But here's the thing, Monica. I don't answer to anyone but the American people." The audience erupted. Applause thundered through the studio. Monica's face burned. JD waited a moment for the noise to settle before he delivered the final blow. "You, on the other hand," he let out a breathy chuckle, shaking his head. "You answer to whoever signs your check." The applause grew louder, but Monica barely heard it. She could feel her control slipping further, like trying to hold onto a rope that was fraying with every second. This was supposed to be her show, her domain, but JD had turned the tables so completely that she no longer felt like the host. She felt like the guest. "That's not true," she said, her voice hoarse. JD simply raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it?" Monica blinked rapidly, willing herself not to break. JD leaned back, shaking his head slightly. "See, that's the problem, Monica. You can't even answer a simple question because deep down you know the truth. You know that if you dared to think for yourself, if you dared to really question the narrative your network pushes, you'd be out of a job tomorrow." Monica flinched. It was in that moment, that tiny flicker of hesitation, that everything changed. Because JD saw it. The audience saw it. America saw it. And then, without warning, the cameras zoomed in, catching the glistening sheen in her eyes, the tightness in her throat, the moment of sheer, undeniable panic that she had tried to bury beneath layers of arrogance. JD let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over the studio like a dense fog. "You want to call me an errand boy?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow more powerful than any shout. "At least I know where I stand. At least I have the courage to stand for something." Monica's breathing hitched. "And you," JD's eyes never left hers, "you stand for nothing." The finality in his words struck like lightning, sending shockwaves through the audience. A sharp inhale rippled through the room. Monica felt the dam crack. Her hands curled into fists beneath the desk. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had to regain control. She had to shut this down before... "Monica," JD said, his voice soft but lethal, "you lost this debate the second you made it about me instead of about the truth." The realization slammed into her with the force of a wrecking ball. She had made this personal. She had underestimated him. She had walked into this studio convinced that she could break JD Vance, that she could tear him down in front of a national audience and make a mockery of him. But now she was the one being torn apart. The cameras captured every detail, the tremor in her hands, the unevenness in her breath, the rapid blinking as she fought to keep the tears from spilling over. The control room was in chaos. Her producers were shouting, scrambling for a way to cut the feed, to salvage what little dignity she had left. But it was too late. The world had already seen it. Monica Bradford, the untouchable, unshakable force of the liberal media, had just been broken on live television. And JD Vance hadn't needed to raise his voice, hurl insults, or rely on theatrics. He had done it with nothing but the truth. Monica Bradford's world was crumbling and she knew it. The weight of JD Vance's words settled over her like a suffocating fog, wrapping around her confidence and squeezing until there was nothing left but raw, exposed vulnerability. She had walked into this interview certain that she could control the conversation, certain that she could humiliate him in front of millions. Instead, she had become the spectacle, the one unraveling, the one losing control, and worst of all, the audience knew it. She shifted in her chair, trying to find an anchor, something, anything to grab onto, but JD's piercing gaze held her in place like an iron grip. "Monica," JD said, his voice calm, unshaken, "this is the part where you have a choice." Her breathing hitched slightly. "A choice," she repeated, her voice thinner than she intended. JD nodded. You can either double down, keep pretending, keep spinning your narrative. He gestured vaguely to the cameras, the audience, the crumbling illusion around them. Or you can do something truly unexpected. Something that takes real courage. She swallowed hard, feeling the heat of the moment pressing in around her. "What's that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. JD leaned forward just slightly, his expression unreadable. "You can admit that you were wrong." The words landed like a sledgehammer. The room went so quiet that Monica swore she could hear her own heartbeat. The studio lights, the teleprompters, the murmurs of the audience, all of it faded into the background. Because JD had just said the one thing she never expected to hear. Admit she was wrong? Admit she had miscalculated? Admit that JD Vance wasn't the fool she had painted him to be, but that she was the one who had been played all along? Her instinct was to lash out, to fight back, to regain the upper hand. That's what she had always done. That's what she had been trained to do. But something about JD's expression, something about the quiet certainty in his tone, made her hesitate. She wanted to deny it, wanted to scoff, roll her eyes, move on, but she couldn't. Because deep down, she knew the truth. For years she had sat in this very chair, looking down at her guests with a practiced smugness, cutting them off when their answers didn't fit her agenda, shaping the conversation to serve her own beliefs rather than the truth. And now she was being held to that same impossible standard, and she couldn't escape it. JD watched her, waiting. He didn't press her. He didn't mock her. He simply let the moments stretch between them, giving her the space to make a decision. Finally, she forced herself to speak. She hesitated, her voice catching in her throat. She took a deep breath and started again. "I don't know." JD arched an eyebrow. "You don't know?" She exhaled sharply. "I don't know if I can do that." JD studied her, then nodded slowly. "At least, that's honest." The audience murmured again, a shift in energy rippling through the room. It wasn't outright applause, but it wasn't hostility either. It was something different, something almost curious. Monica's fingers curled around the edges of her notes, the papers crumpling slightly beneath her grip. "I've built my career on..." She stopped herself, shaking her head. JD finished the sentence for her. "On never admitting you're wrong." She looked up at him, and for the first time since the interview started, she didn't feel like she was sparring with him. She felt like she was being seen. A hollow laugh escaped her lips. "Yeah." JD exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Then maybe it's time for something new." She hesitated. Her mind screamed at her to deny everything, to regain control, to snap back with one final cutting remark. But her heart, the part of her she had silenced for so long, told her something different. And then, without even fully realizing what she was doing, she reached for her microphone and turned toward the audience. She hesitated again. The words weren't coming easily. She glanced at JD, almost searching for some kind of reassurance. He just nodded. She took another breath. "I've spent years tearing people down," she said, her voice quieter now. "I've spent years controlling the conversation, telling people what to think instead of letting them think for themselves." JD didn't say a word. He let her speak. "I've accused people like JD of being blind followers, of being nothing more than loyalists without principles." She let out a short, almost self-deprecating laugh. "But tonight, I've realized something." The audience leaned in, hanging on to every word. She swallowed. "I don't think JD is the blind follower here." The air shifted. JD's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Respect, maybe. Monica looked down at the crumpled notes in her hands, then slowly placed them down on the desk in front of her. She met JD's gaze again. "I think I am." The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, even applause. The control room was in absolute chaos. Her producers were yelling in her earpiece, demanding she backtrack, demanding she cut to commercial. But she ignored them. She was tired. Tired of spinning. Tired of pretending. For the first time in her career, she had just spoken the truth, and it terrified her. JD Vance didn't gloat. He didn't rub it in. He simply watched, nodding once, as if he had seen this coming from the very start. Monica looked back at the cameras. "I don't know what this means," she admitted. "I don't know where I go from here, but I do know one thing." She turned back to JD, her voice steadier now. "I was wrong about you." JD finally allowed himself a small smile. Monica exhaled deeply, almost as if she had just set down a burden she had been carrying for years. And in that moment, she realized something. She hadn't just lost a debate. She had lost an identity she no longer wanted. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to find a new one. The silence that followed Monica Bradford's admission was unlike anything the studio had ever experienced. No scripted debate, no pre-planned rebuttal, no smug closing remark. Just the weight of something raw and real hanging in the air. The audience, the control room, even the cameraman seemed frozen in time, watching the impossible unfold before their eyes. Monica had admitted she was wrong. Not just about JD Vance, not just about this interview, but about everything. The woman who had spent years shaping the narrative, twisting words and tearing down those who dared to challenge her, had just exposed herself in the most vulnerable way possible. And now, there was no taking it back. Her earpiece crackled with panicked voices from producers, desperately trying to salvage the situation. "Monica, walk it back. Say you misspoke. Cut to commercial now." But she didn't move. She couldn't. Because for the first time in her career, she wasn't reading from a script. She wasn't performing. She was simply telling the truth. JD Vance sat across from her, unmoving. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just watched, his expression unreadable. And maybe, just maybe, there was something in his eyes, something like respect. Monica took a slow breath, steadying herself. "I don't expect anyone to suddenly see me differently because of this," she admitted, voice quieter now. "I don't expect forgiveness, or even understanding. But what I do know is that for years I thought I was the one exposing lies, and I never stopped to realize I was the one living one." The room was completely still. JD leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but firm. "So, what are you going to do about it?" The question landed hard. Monica exhaled, looking down at the desk in front of her. She could feel the eyes of millions on her, waiting for her response, and for once she didn't have a polished, rehearsed answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I think it starts with listening." JD nodded slowly, as if acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, this was a turning point. The control room was in full-blown chaos now. Phones were ringing off the hook. Executives were shouting over one another. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a reckoning. Monica looked back into the camera, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "I've spent my career telling people what to think. Maybe it's time I start listening instead." A single tear welled in her eye, but this time, she didn't wipe it away. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't ashamed of the truth. And America was watching. The confrontation between JD Vance and Monica Bradford wasn't just another political debate. It was a defining moment, a clash between deception and truth, arrogance and humility, performance and sincerity. It wasn't about who won the argument. It wasn't about who had the best one-liners. It was about something far more profound. The ability to recognize when you've been wrong, the courage to admit it, and the strength to change. For years, Monica Bradford thrived in an industry built on controlling narratives, shaping public opinion and silencing opposition. She was the master of the ambush, the architect of gotcha journalism. But in this moment, all her usual weapons failed her. Because JD Vance didn't just argue, he exposed. He didn't attack, he revealed. And when faced with the undeniable truth, Monica had only two choices: double down on her facade or confront the reality she had been avoiding. And she did the one thing no one expected. She admitted the truth. That moment holds a powerful lesson for all of us today. We live in an era of information warfare, where opinions are shaped before facts are considered, where narratives are crafted to manipulate rather than to inform, and where admitting fault is seen as a sign of weakness rather than a display of true character. But Monica Bradford's public reckoning serves as a reminder that no matter how far we've gone in the wrong direction, there's always a path back to integrity. This story isn't just about one debate, it's about all of us. It's about the conversations we have every day, the way we engage with different viewpoints, the way we process information, and the way we choose to respond when confronted with uncomfortable truths. Are we willing to listen? Are we strong enough to admit when we've been misled? Do we have the courage to change? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of the power of truth over deception, then don't let this message stop here. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with others. Because now, more than ever, America needs voices that stand for honesty, courage, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. Let this be a reminder. Truth always wins, and when it does, it changes everything.